Thanks, man. Well, I think we can go ahead and get started. Let's start with a word of prayer and then we'll dive in. Father in heaven, thank you for this time that we have to come together and study of your word. We again thank you for those that are present here today. Just help us to have clear minds at this time so that as we enter into study, be with those who are sick or traveling and not able to be with us at this time. And just thank you especially for our Lord and Savior Jesus Christ, Father, who's through whom we have our forgiveness of sins and have a relationship with you. It's in his name we pray. Amen. All right, let's open up to Hosea chapter 7. We're starting a new chapter. In this chapter of Hosea, we're not only starting a new chapter, but we're also starting a new section. The section of the book builds on what was said on chapter 6 about God's people returning to him because of his sins against him. And as a result of these things, as we enter into chapter 7, what we read about in the opening verses of this chapter is about how God was going to bring healing to his people, again with the condition being if they return to him as described in chapter 6. Now, with these things in mind, as we come to the first 3 lines of verse 1 of this chapter, the first 3 lines of verse 1 say, "When I would heal Israel, the iniquity of Ephraim is uncovered, and the evil deeds of Samaria." We're going to pause there, and we'll look at the rest of verse 1 in a minute. But in these first 3 lines of chapter 7, the author of Hosea is bringing to mind the fact that that God was going to bring healing to his people. But he says that in order to make the point that when that healing would occur, it would uncover something about what the text calls the iniquity of Ephraim as well as the evil deeds of Samaria. Now, what does it mean when something is uncovered? It's revealed. That is a good word for it here. So in this case, what's revealed is what the text calls the iniquity of Ephraim and the evil deeds of Samaria. So, and that's just a way, simply put, that's just a way of saying their sins are revealed. Now, with that in mind, one thing we should be reminded here, something about Ephraim and Samaria. We've run into Ephraim before, and closely tied in with it is Samaria. Can anyone remind me of those places, why they're significant? Or what they represent, I guess would be the better question. What do Ephraim and Samaria, Jeremiah, go ahead. Exactly. Samaria was the capital of the northern kingdom of Israel. At this time, the nation of Israel is divided into 2 separate kingdoms. You have Judah down in the south, and then Israel up in the north. Samaria was the capital of the northern kingdom. Now, Samaria might be familiar to us because of the Samaritan woman that we read about in John. This is essentially where she came from. But Samaria, and closely tied in with it, with Ephraim, 2 very prominent places in the northern kingdom. So it's these places that are being named as being representative of the northern nation of Israel. Their sins are uncovered, revealed, or you might say even exposed through this healing that God is going to bring to them. So this is what we're going to deal with today. This healing of Israel, uncovering their sins, that we're going to begin to discuss in the remaining part of verse 1 and going through verse 7 of this chapter, where I think 2 points are made about what sins were uncovered when God would bring healing to his people. Now, the first point that is made in the last parts of verse 1 and going through verse 3 is that the healing of Israel uncovered their crimes, is the language we're going to run into. And the second point that is made in verse 4 and going through verse 7 is that the healing of Israel uncovered their adultery. Now, after looking at these things, what we will learn as far as application goes is that our own healing reveals something about us, and we'll talk about that when we get to that part of the class. Well, let's go ahead and read verses 1 through 7. We'll begin in the middle of verse 1 toward the end and then read through verse 7. So again, we're in Hosea chapter 7, beginning in the last 3 lines of verse 1. It says, "For they deal falsely, the thief enters in, bandits raid outside. And they do not consider in their hearts that I remember all their wickedness. Now their deeds are all around them. They are before my face. With their wickedness they make the king glad, and the princes with their lies. They are all adulterers, like an oven heated by the baker, who ceases to stir up the fire from the kneading of the dough until it is leavened. On the day of our king the princes became sick with the heat of wine. He stretched out his hand with scoffers. For their hearts are like an oven as they approach their plotting. Their anger smolders all night. In the morning it burns like a flaming fire. All of them are hot like an oven, and they consume their rulers. All their kings have fallen. None of them calls on me." Now, I will say this is one of the more difficult sections of Hosea, but we have to remember that this is all about the healing of Israel and what it's uncovered or revealed. So beginning with the last 3 lines of verse 1, we're going to see examples of these crimes that they have committed. There in the last 3 lines, there are 3 examples, but according here to verse 1, what are they doing? How are they dealing with people? Falsely. What does that mean? They're liars. Might use that word. So yes, they're lying in their dealings with others. As a result of these things, next the author says that another example of their crimes is the thief enters in, is what the text says. Now, what do we think of when we think of a thief? A robber, somebody who steals. So this deals with so as that ties in with Israel, what are they guilty of? Stealing. They're stealing from each other. Stealing and cheating each other. So by phrasing, now it says the thief enters in, but closely tied in with that is this bandits of raiding outside. Now, what do you think of when you think of bandits? All right, so highway robbers, these are gangs of people. It's closely tied in with the thief. But we had in that, as far as the thief, it says the thief enters in, but where are these bandits? They raid without. Do you have the word without there? Okay. That's the picture here. They're doing this very openly. So these are, it is that highway robber picture that's being here. Now this word bandits, it's in the plural as we see. So this is a word that refers to a gang of people who take from others. So it builds on the thief from the previous line. So with all, any other questions or comments on verse 1? All right, let's go to verse 2. Now verse 2, the author goes on to record a statement from God that deals with the fact of how Israel is essentially responding to what they're doing. What are they not doing? They're at the beginning of verse 2. Okay, they do not consider. Now you have their hearts. Okay, the New American Standard has in their hearts. So we have this concept of the hearts coming forth. Now, when we talk about our heart in this particular way, what are we referring to? It has to do with your conscience, your mind. So with that in mind, what the author records here paints the picture that Israel, they're not really thinking about how this is making God feel, as a way of putting it, but more specifically, they're not thinking about the fact that God is seeing what they're doing. The text says that I remember all their wickedness. Now their deeds are all around them. They are before my face. So God is seeing what's going on. This is all in God's presence. Now we talk about how God cannot be in the presence of sin. That's true. But that doesn't mean he doesn't see what's going on. But the point of this verse is the fact that God's people, they're not thinking about this. They're just doing their sin, stealing from each other, being these bandits, cheating each other, but they give no consideration to the fact that God is watching all of this go on. Questions or comments on verse 2? Yeah, that's right. This is an application of that. God. That's Judge's language. Yeah. Mhm. That was a good consideration. So yeah, so that's application of what's said here in verse 2, that people are not thinking about the big picture, so to speak, of how God can see what's going on. And again, the application is God sees what we do, even if nobody else does. Anything else on verse 2? Okay. So we have this idea of wickedness in verse 2, and that's carried forward into verse 3. But now we're turning to God's people's relationship with these kings and these princes. Now, how are the kings and princes feeling about what God's people are doing? They're glad. What does it mean to be glad? Exactly. Part of the picture here is that they're approving of it. It's making them happy what God's people are doing. So we have these words, kings and princes. Now, what do we usually associate with that? Leaders. So again, here, part of what we're running to in Hosea is the fact that the leadership is guilty. Not just God's people, not the average Joes, but also the leadership are guilty. And a lot of the reason God's people are engaged in the behavior that there are is because that's the example being set by the leadership. The kings and princes would be the secular leadership, but also in Hosea, it's the spiritual leadership that's doing the same things. But here, the point is that these leaders are happy with what God's people are doing. As Dean put it, they're encouraging it, they approve of it. But God, on the other hand, does not approve of it. He's not pleased with these crimes that they're committing. Um, Anything else on verse 3? Yeah, they are held to a higher standard. So, yeah, it is. But they're not thinking about it. That's part of what this text is telling us. Um, any other questions or comments? All right. So putting verses 1 through 3 together, the point of this section, as far as what the healing of Israel revealed or uncovered, is that the healing of Israel uncovered their crimes. Now, in these verses, the author has shown that the healing of God's people revealed the things that they were doing. And part of what that means is these things that they were doing showed that they needed this healing that God was going to bring to them. But all the same, God was not pleased with what they were doing. But as a result, out of his grace that we often talk about, God was going to heal them from the spiritual injuries that their sinful behavior was bringing upon them. So this brings us to verses 4 through 7, another point about what the healing of Israel uncovered, and that is their adultery. And we see that in the fact that in verse 4 we find this statement, they are all adulterers, is how verse 4 begins. And we'll look at the illustration here in a minute. What's an adulterer? Okay, that's the main definition we give to it is, yes, person who steps out on their spouse. You're going to hear more about it in my sermon this morning, but I won't go there. But yes, this is how God's people are being pictured, as these adulterers. Why? They haven't been faithful to God. So we do see some of this language in Hosea about adultery in terms of God's people's and their relationship with God. But here, this point is illustrated, as the text says, like an oven heated by the baker who ceases to stir up the fire from the kneading of the dough until it is leavened. Now here's where this section gets a little bit more difficult. I'm still struggling with it even now because it's really hard to figure out. But we're going to try, and I think we'll gain some understanding from it. So, God's people are adulterers. We need to keep that in mind to understand this illustration. So, the point is being established using the image of this oven along with this baker who ceases to stir up the fire. Now, we'll pause with that. Now, what picture comes to mind when you think of a baker who ceases to stir up the fire? What's this baker not doing? Okay, he's not doing his job, but according to this language, what's his job? To keep the fire stirred up. Go ahead, Dean. Right, to keep the fire going, get it hotter. It's the idea of regulating the temperature of the oven. So the oven's going. He's not regulating the temperature as he should. But the language doesn't stop there. It's from the kneading of the dough until it is leavened. So here the author is picturing the adultery of God's people as bakers. They're heating their ovens, but they're failing to keep the heat of their ovens under control. Now, what's the bread supposed to do in this case? It's supposed to rise. But if this baker is not regulating the temperature, according to this language, that's not going to happen. That's what this idea of leavened has to do with, is it rises. So, and I know, Sandy, you're very familiar with this because you're involved in culinary things. So, but we have to ask, how does this apply to God's people being adulterers? The idea seems to be that God's people are not doing what they should be doing, with the result being that they're separated from God, as the context of Hosea describes. Questions or comments on that before we go to verse 5? Okay. So verse 5, the author of Hosea turns his attention to what the text calls the day of our kings, and the princes became sick with the heat of wine, and that this king stretched out his hand with scoffers. So in this verse, the author of Hosea is now turning his attention to the behavior of the Israelite leadership that we've already looked at, these kings and princes. What are they doing? Keep in mind this wine language. We don't know exactly, but it's drunkenness is the main idea here, but yes, what your liver does with alcohol would be a part of that. So, um, but yes, they're getting drunk. But the text also tells us when they're getting drunk, and that's this day of our King. Now, this day of our King, in the cultural context, is a reference to festivals that would be held on the honor of the King. A lot of heavy drinking would occur in a lot of cases. So yes, that's part of the picture being painted here, that they're getting drunk during this festival. But the king is also guilty of something, the king himself, as he's stretching out his hand with scoffers. Can anyone tell me what a scoffer is? Mockers, okay. Yeah, some translations do have that word. What is a mocker? That's it. So somebody who makes fun of somebody else. So with that in mind, what does it mean when the king stretches out his hand with scoffers? He's accepting them, possibly participating in the scoffing himself. Okay, so people laugh at God. Now they might be laughing at God in this one, but the text, at least in the New American Standard and others, don't put the word God here, but they are doing that by implication in their behavior because of how they're treating God and the things that they're doing. Yeah, they would be. So, and we saw that back in verse 1. They're stealing from each other and cheating each other. So, um, so the behavior described in this verse not only deals with drunkenness, but also with that what that drunken behavior leads to. The scoffing and other behaviors we might associate with drunkenness. Go ahead, Sandy. Yeah, and we'll get there. So, because that's the end result of all this. But anything else on verse 5? That's true. If you've ever seen a drunk person, you know what that looks like. So, um, they don't have any filter on them as far as the things they say. Anything else on verse 5? All right. So, verse 6, we come back to the oven imagery, but in this case, it's applied to the people's hearts. So the text says, therefore, their hearts are like an oven. And we'll pause with that. Now, again, what do we know about ovens? They're hot. So this verse uses that language, but this time it's their hearts, hot like an oven. What else does the text tells us about how their hearts are like an oven? Yeah, burn with intrigue. Okay, the New American Standard has, for their hearts are like an oven as they approach their plotting. Um, but I have a footnote here that says the word plotting could also be literally translated as ambush. Um, okay, that we'll get to that as well. Well, that's in verse 7, but we're in verse 6. That's okay. Okay, what's the picture here that's being painted about what they're doing? Okay? So they're making kind of plans, but they're bad plans, not good plans. And we see that because the next line, the next part of this verse talks about their anger. So their hots being hot like an oven has something to do with the fact that they're continually angry and they're plotting. So so far it seems to be that they're plotting against people that they're angry with for whatever reason, holding these grudges, we might say. And so, what's happening with their anger? Jeremiah, is your hand up? Okay, that would make sense from the context because of what the king is doing. But the language used here is that their anger smolders all night. So what's happening with their anger? They're not letting it go. It's, might say, holding that grudge. And the next morning, the text says it burns like a flaming fire. Now, how does all this tie in with the oven imagery? Right. So that it's the picture of this oven just getting hotter and hotter to the point that it becomes this flaming fire. Now, ovens at this time, there weren't like what we got back here. It was an oven that had a literal fire in it. I don't know all the details about this oven, but they were different than ours today. Go ahead, Andrew. Right, right. Yeah. So, so with that in mind, the oven imagery is used differently here than it is back when we were talking about the adultery fact back in verse 4. So what the author does not record here is why this anger exists in the first place, but Jeremiah offered a good possibility, and that's because of who the king is consorting with. But they're holding this anger, they're plotting against the king, and we'll see that in verse 7. But anything else on verse 6? Okay. That's true. Yeah. Right. So they are, as Andrew put it very well, they're following in the example of the world. Yeah. So anything else on verse 6? Okay. So verse 7, the oven imagery continues, and the statement is this. Verse 7 begins to summarize what we've been looking at so far, but it says all of them are hot like an oven. All these people that have been described in the context. But now we run into more of this language in the relationship with the king. What are with the rulers and kings? The text says, what are they doing? Okay, they're not following God, but what are they doing with their rulers and kings? They're destroying their rulers. The result, all their kings have fallen. So these people are going after the leadership and out of this place of anger. Well, what are they not doing? None of them are calling on God. So the people, verses 5 and 6, are carrying within themselves this anger. It's directed toward their leadership, and they're destroying their rulers, and their kings are falling. So this further paints the picture that the plotting described in verse 6 is plotting against their kings to see how they can destroy their kings and their leaders of any sort, but they're not turning to God in doing so. Questions or comments on verse 7? So the point we should see from verses 4 through 7 about what the healing of Israel uncovered is that the healing of Israel uncovered their adultery. Now, in these verses, the author of Hosea has shown that the healing of Israel revealed that they were living in adultery in their relationship with God. This adultery was revealed in the fact that they were not doing what God expected of them. It was evidenced in the fact that their kings were not doing what God called them to do. And so the adultery of God's people was also revealed in the fact that his people were working against those who were in authority over them. And so the final piece of evidence that God's people were living in adultery is that they were not turning to God in any of these things. None of them calls on me. So, when we consider everything from verses 1 through 7, the point we should be left with is that the healing of Israel revealed certain things about them. It revealed their crimes against God, and it revealed their adultery. So the application to us is virtually the same. Our own healing reveals something about us. The healing we have received from God reveals that we too are sinful people. We need that healing. So we must have a willingness to recognize our own sin and do so for the purpose of receiving that healing that God gives us through Jesus. Dean, go ahead. It's true. That's true. Some people have that mindset. I can do it on my own. I don't need God's healing, we might say. Anything else? All right. Matt, will you close us today?